So typically, this presentation is geared for parents of children with autism spectrum disorder and other developmental disabilities. Realistically, it is appropriate for anybody who's working with learners around this age group. In terms of just being, I like to think about it as a refresher on all of the puberty related things that are relevant for our learners. My office, we tend to work with a lot of, we don't work with a lot of little ones in my office. We tend to work with the pubescent kids, the teenagers, even the young adults up to about 21, sometimes older, depending on insurance. And what we find often is parents who are unprepared for this. When we're thinking about our typically developing kids and how their bodies change and having those conversations with them, it seems to come naturally to us, or more naturally to us, I should say. But when we're talking to kids who have developmental disabilities, IQs in the 40s or perhaps lower, it becomes more challenging. And it's interesting because one of the learners that we're having this issue with right now, my BCABA and I did some parent training the other night, and the dad has a PhD in psychology. He's not a clinician. He's got an experimental degree, and he's a professor. But even I found I kind of joked with him a little bit afterwards. Even he was uncomfortable bringing up the conversation with us. And he said, we really have to start thinking about the fact that well, right. And you get that stammering and that hesitation. And he goes, his body is going to change. And I said, Igor, come on, we're adults. We can have this conversation, and he loosened up a little bit. Um, but one of the things that he and I were discussing yesterday at pickup is I pulled a whole bunch of books off my shelf, which I'm gonna show you guys in a few minutes here. But even the books that are written for uh, working with learners with developmental disabilities are often still too complex for some of our learners. And so then it becomes more important for parents and clinicians, educators, et cetera, to be armed with the information to be able to figure out how to teach appropriately. All right. So our goal here for today is to identify aspects of sexual development going through adulthood, identify some key features of puberty, and identify some strategies to help address common behavior concerns during puberty. I'm going to I'm going to state here that because I'm talking about a medical issue, a medical scenario of puberty, this is a biological process. I do refer to males and females. I'm not using gender neutral language throughout my talk um, because, again, I'm approaching this from more of a medical perspective than a social perspective, if that makes sense. And I hope I'm not inadvertently offending anybody. It's certainly possible you're working with students who are gender nonconforming. And there are ways to adapt things, but ultimately, we're still talking about biology and we're talking about body parts. Okay. All right. So, generally speaking, and this is not specific to ASD, it's generally, more general developmental disability, but from your experiences, what are some reasons that we don't openly have these conversations about sexuality and puberty? Whether it's with parents or fellow educators or fellow clinicians or the learners themselves. You can chime in on the chat. I don't know if folks can come off mute. Whoops. As a parent, you have felt unprepared. Okay. Don't have knowledge. Okay. So just out of curiosity, is the child that you have now with the developmental disability, is this your first child or only child to be going through puberty? First child. Okay. So Um, I'm also curious, like what was presented to you when you were going through puberty? Nothing. Love it. My mother, may she rest in peace, was a nurse, and she still presented nothing to me about puberty. So you are far from alone. Your mother informed me. Okay. And was it just very basics, Andra, like very basics about menstruation, menstrual hygiene, things like that, as opposed to better understanding of what was going on in your body?
Um, my mother always spoke with me openly, so I would say not basics. Actually, when she explained me, I remember this time I had these questions. Why does she tell me so much about puberty? I'm not interested in. So, and when I wasn't ready, and when I wasn't puberty, so everything was known for me. And I grew up in Soviet Union, so this
Uh,
there were no puberty, no sex, nothing at all.
Right, right. I have a couple of colleagues who are from Russia, and we've had some similar conversations. And I do a lot of work with other countries as well, where this is completely novel. I did a webinar for physicians at the national level in the Philippines. And some of the stuff that I was discussing with medical providers was new stuff. And I was like, How did you get through medical school?" Okay, so that gives me a little bit of an idea about what we're looking at here. Okay. So some basics that I want to start with. We are all sexual beings. And sexuality as a human process is a birth to death thing. If any of you have sons, you might have had the experience of seeing a little boy with an erection on an ultrasound. And I asked my friend, Dr. Mitch Tepper once, why do little boys get erections in utero? And his answer was because they can. But the idea is that all of these sexual processes happen throughout the lifespan. And there are things that happen in infancy. There are things that happen before the child is born. There are things that happen in adulthood, etc. But the important component for working with learners who have developmental disabilities is that sexual development occurs separately from intellectual development. So the body is still going to progress at the normal body rate, even if the individual has a low IQ, has developmental disability issues. And that makes it harder for us as parents, as clinicians, as educators, because we have to figure out how to keep them understanding what's going on with their bodies and knowing how to address things, even though they don't have yet the intellectual capacity, and they may never have the intellectual capacity. Um, so it becomes about teaching skills in a simple way. Roxana, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. I just noticed that you weren't muted, so I just wanted to make sure you didn't need to ask something or chime in. All right, so now let's talk about infants and toddlers for a minute. Um, okay, so it is very, very typical for young children, all humans, to explore their bodies, including their genitals. Babies, infants, tend to become aware of their genitals sometime around 8 to 10 months. This is the time that you're changing diapers, you take off a diaper, and their hands go right to their genitals. Very common. As we're teaching children, young children, toddlers, and preschoolers the names of their body parts, like we do the head, shoulders, knees, and toes song, we teach them, oh, that's your nose, right? We should be teaching them the proper names of their genitals. It's not helpful, in fact, it's sometimes harmful to teach cute little euphemisms. I'll give an example of my own child, my now almost 27-year-old, he'll be 27 on Sunday, um, is on the autism spectrum. And when he was little, we had lots of services in place. He was very difficult to toilet train. He was very difficult in general. And as he was potty training, I had these lovely therapists who came to my house and they taught him these cute little euphemistic terms. And one day he came home from school and he said, Mommy, and he named some other kid in his class, Johnny touched my Twinkie. All right. Well, if you know anything about pastries in on the East Coast, a Twinkie is a yellow cake with a white cream inside. It's made by a company called Hostess, and it's not readily available in the Midwest. There's an equivalent, I don't remember what it's called. But Twinkie was also one of the words that these lovely Greek um, ABA therapists taught him as a euphemism for his penis. Okay, so now as a mom, did I have to be alarmed that his classmate touched him in a sexually inappropriate manner? Or was there an issue with his friend touching his snack at snack time? Right? So that's just an example of the importance of teaching proper genital names, because how else can the kid report to you accurately that somebody touched them inappropriately? I frequently speak with a clinical psychologist named Frank Cicero, who's just a doll, and he's super fun. And he said in his family, they all of the women refer to their genitalia as a muff. Okay, but that could also be for some people that's an alternate name for a scarf. Um, and so again, we want to make sure that we're not using terms that could be confused for something that's not a problem. And then the child is trying to communicate to us that somebody touched them inappropriately or that something hurts, right? So we want to want to teach those body parts correctly. When kids are toddlers, that's the best time to start teaching about privacy. Potty training, bath time, getting dressed, those are all great opportunities to learn about closing doors, right? Oh, we're taking off your diaper now. Let's close the door. Oh, we're going to have a bath. Let's close the door. Oh, we're sitting on the potty. Let's close the door. This becomes more important when you have a kid with a developmental disability who's going to have a harder time learning those transitions and those social skills. It's not uncommon for folks to not even think twice about changing their baby's diaper in a public place. I see it all the time, right? You go to the mall, somebody's changing a diaper out in public. You go to the park, somebody's changing a diaper out in public. You go to a school event, somebody's changing a diaper out in public. But what are we teaching children when we do that? That genitals are not private. So it becomes more important, again, when we have a learner with a developmental disability to, as early as possible, start making sure that we do those things in private so that we don't have to suddenly start trying to teach them when they're 7 or 8 years old that it's no longer cute to run around without your pants on. Or worse, 16 or 17 years old, or 26 or 27 years old. Too often I'm saying, hey, that's not a Walmart activity. So the sooner we start teaching these things, the better. Um, Now, preschoolers, it is very normal for children to touch their bodies for pleasure, including their genitals. We want to make sure that we're teaching children to do this in their bedrooms. I was communicating with a colleague today in Germany, and she's working with a 13-year-old who has a routine of sitting and watching cartoons on the living room couch at the end of the day while engaging in some sexual behavior. And this is very upsetting to his grandmother. And I said, rightfully so. This is a bedroom activity, not a living room activity. And so we need to teach him that this is something we do in the bedroom and that it's not okay to do this in the living room. And again, the earlier we start teaching this, the better. So it's okay for preschoolers to touch their genitals. In fact, a lot of toddlers and preschoolers very commonly engage in some sort of masturbation before nap time or sleep time because it is a self-soothing activity. Adults do so for the same reason often. By about 4, I did mention that, some of you may have children who are gender nonconforming. By about 4, most typically developing kids are solid in their own gender identity and that of others. So if you have a child who's gender nonconforming, um, you probably would be seeing those signs by about the age of 4, sometimes younger. Preschoolers tend to commonly ask questions about their own body parts and other people's body parts. It's funny with these parents that we were meeting with the other night, um, they commented that it occurred to them recently that their son never asked why his sister or his mother don't have a penis like he does, because they were kind of expecting that question. Kids ask about those things, right? They ask about their body parts. They ask about other people's body parts, especially if they're maybe taking a bath with a cousin or a sibling, or happen to be in the bathroom with mom or dad. They start asking these questions when they see other people's bodies. Preschoolers always ask that dreaded "where do babies come from" question. Um, and typically it's best to be honest. You don't have to give a whole college level lecture to a 4-year-old. Um, but I have a colleague slash friend here in I live in South Bend, Indiana. There's a couple here. The wife is a social worker, and the husband is a clinical psychologist. And of all people, I would have expected them to be open with their kids, and they are very not. And so I guess at some point, mom was pregnant with the youngest, and there's a big age gap. And so what the next kid up or two kids up asked mom, how did the baby get in there? And she said, well, mom and dad have a special hug, and there are seeds that go from dad to mom when there's a hug when they hug. And the kid was afraid to walk into their bedroom after that because he didn't want to get hit with seeds. So so maybe that wasn't the best description to give their then 7 or 8-year-old, right? So being open about things like you again, you don't have to give a 4-year-old a whole discourse on intercourse and ovaries and sperm and eggs and all of that, but coming up with something that a 4-year-old could understand um, is important, and making sure they don't think they're going to get hit with watermelon seeds if they walk into mom and dad's bedroom. And then still, like I said before, always making sure that the door is closed when they're getting dressed, using the bathroom. Same for you. Bathroom, doors should be closed. Um, Babies came from kissing and that was in 5th grade. Oh my Lord. Oh my Lord. Please tell me you fixed that.
I fixed, but this said this friend of her, and most probably she had this information. They said it's a real trauma when somebody.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's terrible. For 5th grade, they should definitely have better sex education than that. All right. Trying to keep the vocal cords lubricated here. All right. Elementary school kids. So it is normal for kids in elementary school to prefer same-sex playmates. For children who are gender nonconforming, they tend to prefer to play with children of their identified gender. So if we have a biological male who presents as a female or identifies as a female, they tend to prefer to play with other girls. Where you see this change a little bit, is when kids are typically developing kids pick up on the social cues of their non their gender identity not being quite as accepted. So I know somebody who grew up in a fairly rural part of Indiana. Indiana is a very conservative state, so a rural, very, very conservative area. Um, and they are a biological male, gender non-conforming, and they can very well pull off the, typical lumberjack persona, um, because it was not accepted in that rural community to present as anything other than extremely rugged man if you were a biological male. In elementary school, kind of like you just brought up, Andra, children do start to ask questions about sex. They tend to understand and ask questions about gender roles. I had an experience a couple years ago. I was at one of the rabbi's houses for lunch one weekend, and their, I don't know, 6 or so year old turned to me at some point. I was sitting next to the kid, and he looks at me. He goes, well, what's your name anyway? And I said, I'm Dr. Stein. And he goes, you're not a doctor, you're a girl. And I looked at the rabbi's wife and I said, has your child never encountered a female doctor before? And she's thinking there for a minute. She goes, every doctor we've ever been to so far happens to be a man. So kids do have this idea sometimes based on who they're encountering, right? That like the garbage truck person is probably a guy. The nurse is more likely to be a female. Your teacher, depending on where you go to school, is more likely to be a female, right? So kids start to get this idea of those gender roles and who takes care of the children and who takes out the trash and things like that. So kids start to get this by elementary school. And when they see something that's different, they start to wonder, why is that lady cutting the grass? Why isn't a man doing it for her, right? Um, because she doesn't need one. All right, preteens. We tend to dread this point in our kids' lives. Preteens, kids start to change physically. Like this parent was talking with us the other day. His child is 10 or 9, I don't remember. Girls begin to develop breasts and body hair growth, genitals mature. Menstruation might begin in preteen age. It might not. Yeah, the boys, the genitals mature. They start to get a little facial hair, little mustaches, little wisps around their chins. Now, kids are very conscious typically about their body changes and their sexuality. They have concerns about what's normal, especially if kids are in situations where there are like locker room scenarios, like pre-gym, and they're changing, they're seeing other people's bodies. They want to know, their friends are talking about things. They want to know what's normal when they're going to experience things. Um, and self-esteem is somewhat tied to where kids fall out on these body changes. So kids who are either early or late on these body changes tend to struggle a bit more with self-esteem. The ones who are early are self-conscious because their bodies have changed much earlier than their peers. The ones who are late are self-conscious because their bodies have not changed yet and the rest of their peers have. And so it becomes important. I had this conversation with one of my own children when she was 13. Um, it becomes important to recognize that there is a range of what's normal and have that conversation with our kids about, hey, this is a range. Not everyone is 11 years old on the dot or 13 years old on the dot. It can happen anywhere between 10 and 13 or 10 and 14, whatever it is. And, you know, we'll keep an eye on things. And if something is a concern, we'll talk to your doctor about it and things like that. So when we think about hormones, puberty is not an event. It is a process that takes many years. So the changes in the brain actually start as young as 6 to 8 years old. The body changes start a little bit later. They can start as early as 8 or 9. You might start seeing hair in new places, kids who smell a little funky. They're starting to have those growth spurts. Um, sorry. Um, that can start as early as 8 or 9. Um, a little bit of breast budding, we call it, where there's like a little rounding of the breast tissue. Um, and so we start to see increases in the sex hormones. The increases for the boys start somewhere between 9.5 and 13.5. With we see mostly testosterone as the primary sex hormone for biological males, 7.5 to 12-ish for the girls. Mostly we're looking at estradiol here, but also a little bit of progesterone. And these continue to increase until mid-adolescence. So we see this very gradual increase, and then it starts to climb more steeply. For biological girls, the first period tends to be somewhere between 12 and 13, maybe 11. We're trending earlier and earlier. Um, um, what's interesting is that ovulation tends to start later. The older a girl is when she gets her first period, the closer she is to ovulation. Those first periods where she's not ovulating yet, we call those anovulatory, meaning the periods are happening without ovulation. This means that the periods are likely to be irregular, which is very challenging when you're working with a child with a developmental disability or especially autism, and they want things on schedule. So the strategy becomes making sure that they're prepared all the time. Um, you can certainly start tracking if you have a girl. You can certainly start tracking those periods on an app. It'll make things easier for you and for her and probably everybody else around her. Um, but don't be surprised if those first few months, maybe even 2 years, up to 3 years, might be irregular because she's not ovulating yet. For the, Excuse me. For the biological boys, sexual maturity tends to be finished sometime between 13 and 18, usually on that later end. For the biological girls, the sexual maturity tends to be finished sometime between 12 and a half and 18. This means that their genitals are no longer changing. They usually have reached their terminal height. The boys will still be growing a little bit, usually in early college years. Um, it's funny because my daughter just finished her undergraduate, and I'm still on the Facebook page for the parents of that college. And I always chuckle when there's some mom who's looking for where can my son get pants? He had a growth spurt and his pants are all too short. And it's usually a freshman who's, 18, as opposed to a senior who's 21 or 22, right? Um, So that when we have the sexual maturity is there, we're looking at for the biological females, we're looking at periods are regular, body changes are finished for both the males and the females, um, and they're not mostly done growing. They're not growing anymore for the most part. Now, these hormonal changes, especially the increases in testosterone, estradiol, and progesterone, affect the brain. They affect our behavior. They affect our ability to regulate our behavior and our mood. And if, I mean, based on the group who's in here, most of us, we're all adults. We've all experienced these hormonal changes ourselves. Most of us probably have or still are experiencing menstrual cycles. And we know how our behavior and mood changes throughout a month, right? So the mood and self-esteem fluctuations occur with fluctuations in estrogen specifically throughout the menstrual cycle. Um, Mid-cycle, when female estrogen is at its highest, is usually associated with the best mood and the best self-esteem. There's actually research that talks about if you want to go for a job interview or ask your boss for a raise, you should go when you're ovulating and your estrogen is at its highest because you'll have the best self-esteem and you'll kind of put your best foot forward, if you will. Um, Aggression is associated sometimes with changes and increases in testosterone. So this is why biological males often become more aggressive during puberty. And this is again going back to this 10-ish-year-old in my office. We've started seeing some more aggression with him at school. Um, and there's like a group chat between the teacher and the parents and my assistant behavior analyst. And one of the things he and I talked about is, you know what, we've seen a height increase in this little guy, and now we're seeing some increases in aggression. Is some of this potentially puberty related increases in testosterone? We're still going to address things from a behavior modification, a behavior analysis standpoint, but that's something that we're definitely thinking about in the back of our minds. Teenagers, again, not everybody's favorite time of life, right? A lot of people are like, hey, can we just like cryogenically freeze the kid for 16 years or something like that and, defrost them when they're 25? Wouldn't that be fun? No. Children begin to understand the means and consequences of sexual expression when they're teenagers. So usually around late middle school to early high school, they start to understand. They also start to understand and recognize healthy and unhealthy relationships. I remember observing this with my youngest when she was in school. Most of my kids, all of my kids, were homeschooled at different points in time. And she's the only one who went to middle school and some high school in an actual traditional school setting. So it was interesting for me to hear her observations of her classmates from middle school and high school about boyfriends and girlfriends, or boyfriends and boyfriends, or girlfriends and girlfriends, and who was having what kinds of relationships and who was in a healthy relationship because they communicated well versus somebody who was controlling. And these are things she was recognizing in middle school and high school, and I thought that was really interesting. Um, And so when children are exposed to unhealthy relationships, I just think about, for example, like parents who are in a toxic marriage, for example, or somebody who's in an unhealthy partnership of some sort. Your kids, not your kids, but the kids recognize it very often, and it can be important to. Um, keep in mind that children, even as young as seventh grade, sometimes even younger, can pick up on those things. And we want to make sure that we are modeling healthy behaviors and healthy relationships for our kids so that when they establish their own relationships, they are bringing healthy behaviors into those relationships. All right, adults with developmental disabilities, a lot of them do enter partnered relationships, sexual relationships. I've worked with several adults with developmental disabilities. I've done some sex education to ensure that they can consent, or say to teams like, hey, I don't think I can get this person to the capacity of consent. Um, I've worked with a lot of adults with developmental disabilities who need to learn relationship skills and how to communicate with a partner. Excuse me. Um, and who have questions about sexuality, sexual behaviors, and things like that. And the one thing I tell staff and parents and guardians is it is crucial. I get that it's vastly inappropriate, not inappropriate, sorry, vastly uncomfortable, and it feels inappropriate, but it is so, so crucial that we are open and honest with young adults with developmental disabilities about sexuality, sexual behavior, and relationships because they are so vulnerable. And it is so increasingly likely that they will be exploited at some point or harmed at some point. I worked with a young man. I just did a couple of sessions with him, but he had we'll loosely say the term friend, who was also had a developmental disability, but was higher functioning, had better cognitive and social skills. And he was grooming this young man and ended up getting him to engage in some sexual behavior that was not completely consensual. Um, but this young man who I worked with for a few sessions really just didn't have the skills and the knowledge that he didn't have to cooperate and that he could say no and that he should tell somebody. He just didn't know. And it came out in a conversation with his mom, who lived multiple states away. So it became then a crisis. So that's just an example of why it's so important to be very, very open. I say often it's about as comfortable for us to think about our kids having sex as it is to think about our parents having sex. But our job is to protect our kids and to protect the people we work with and support. And the best way to do that is through education. We're not going to be able to shelter our kids and the people we work with forever. So the best approach is education, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And one of the things I really love about giving these kinds of talks is helping parents, especially, but clinicians as well, become more comfortable with these topics and become more comfortable having these conversations. All right, so what is the parent's role? Number one, as I've been saying, be open, answer questions honestly. Try not to use a lot of euphemisms, cute terms for things. Just use the regular language so that your son or your daughter, your child has the language needed to communicate back to you or to a teacher or to a staff support person, especially if something is wrong with that, has gone wrong, whether it's a medical issue or they've been touched inappropriately, etc. We want to respect privacy and teach our children which activities are not to be done in public. I refer to these as closed door activities. I don't talk about the term privacy a whole lot because it is a very vague term. Privacy could mean I don't open your mail. Privacy could mean I don't listen in on your phone call. Privacy could mean I don't read your diary. Privacy could mean I don't walk in on you in the bathroom. Privacy could mean I close the door when I get dressed, right? So privacy as a term means very different things. And so I like to be very concrete when I'm working with learners who have developmental disabilities and talk about open door and closed door activities. One of the studies in my dissertation was teaching these open door, closed door activities to, at the time, he was a teenager with autism and an IQ in the 20s, actually. And this was a young man who was regularly dropping his pants in public places. Um, so we taught him where it was okay, and where, that he needed to go to a closed door place and close a door. We're working on this now with another young man uh, who we're actually revisiting it with him because he doesn't have an issue in my office with exposing himself, but he's doing it at school. And we think it's because he's getting a whole lot of attention for it, but we are revisiting the training of the closed door activity versus the open door activity just to reinforce that behavior a little bit. We want to make sure it is our job as parents to make sure that our kids have access to sexual health care. So if we have a young adult with a developmental disability, we want to make sure that they are getting the proper exams. Um, a lot of people have this idea that, if somebody has a developmental disability, they don't need pap smears and they don't need breast exams and all this other stuff. They don't need GYN exams, and that's not true. People with developmental disabilities can still get sexual health issues. They can still get breast cancer, they can still get other cancers, they can still have other sexual health problems, bacterial vaginosis, yeast infections, etc. And we need to make sure that our kids are getting the proper medical care. Again, no matter how uncomfortable it is, we're still going to have to do this. Yeah, I think back to when my son was, I think he was about 12, and he sent me a text message one day and he goes, Mom, I need to go to the doctor. And I said, Why? What's going on? I can make an appointment with Sherry. We had a nurse practitioner in the pediatric office. He goes, No, no, I only want to see Dr. Hudson, who is a man. And I said, Well, Dr. Hudson retired a couple months ago. What's going on? And he said to me, Well, I need a man doctor. And I said, Okay, well, I can call, but I need to know what's going on. He goes, My balls hurt. I said, All right. And I called up the pediatric office and I said, Listen, I know that Sherry is our typical provider. However, my son is having a sexual health issue and he would like to see one of the men. And sure enough, they called me back 20 minutes later and said, Hey, Dr. Kinney will see him this afternoon. Great. And then Dr. Kinney became my son's doctor after that instead of Sherry, because that's what he was more comfortable with. And that was completely appropriate for a 12 or 13-year-old, right? But again, we need to be prepared for potentially our kids saying, Hey, my balls hurt, or the equivalent for a biological female, right? Ensure and, if necessary, provide sex education in a way that your kid can understand. I have a ton. I have a library of pictures. Um, there's software called Boardmaker, which some of you might be familiar with if your child uses any kind of communication device. It usually uses these Mayer-Johnson symbols. And I still have the CD, and computers with CD-ROM players are pretty hard to come by, but I have an old computer from like 2005 sitting on my desk just so that I can run this program, because they have an add-on software called Communicating About Sexuality, and it's got 1,100 images related to sex education and sexual health. And the only way to get them and run them was through the CD. So I still have it. There are other ways of coming across these pictures, but you don't want to be in the position of having to go to Google Images and ask Google Images for sexual pictures, right? That can get you in trouble. So that's why I like having the software available to me and not having to explain to the FBI why I was Googling pictures of genitalia. So be prepared to have these conversations with your students, your kids, and be prepared to use pictures, but be prepared to get those pictures safely. And I'm happy to provide images to people if they need, because again, I do have them. Now, we did talk about privacy already, and I discussed this actually the other day with this family when we were doing the parent training, and I kind of gave the example with my assistant behavior analyst. Um, Dave Hingsberger talked about this. Peter Gerhardt talks about this as well. Private parts are not just the things that are covered by your underwear or your bathing suit. Your entire body is private. I do not have permission to just come and touch you anywhere on your body. If I were to come up and start stroking your hair, that would be really inappropriate. Unless we had some sort of prior relationship where that's appropriate, right? So Dave Hingsberger in one of his books talks about a gentleman who got arrested for assault because he put his hand on a woman's thigh on the bus. And when they talked to him about it, he said, But I didn't touch her private parts. And so the education then became about explaining that everybody's body is private to them, and we can't just touch people without permission. And so this is again why I don't like this idea of privacy, because it becomes a very vague term. Okay. All right, masturbation, everybody's favorite topic. Um, Masturbation will not just go away if we ignore it. It is a self-reinforcing behavior, shall we say, right? The person who is engaging in masturbation and gets the pleasure out of it, gets the good body feelings out of it. And we have to keep in mind that our learners, our kids, often do not have and will not have opportunities for partnered sex, and that masturbation is likely for many people with developmental disabilities, masturbation is going to be their primary sexual behavior. Um, we also need to keep in mind, as kind of I've led up to, that our kids have normal biological hormonal urges. Often what's the problem is that they don't have the social skills to go with them. So you're typically developing seventh, eighth, ninth grader knows that it's not cool to walk around school with an erection, knows that they can't drop their pants and masturbate in the classroom or the public bathroom or whatever. But kids with developmental disabilities don't have those social skills. The parents of this 10-year-old that we were talking with the other night are very concerned that, especially because he's got this history of being aggressive and currently he's targeting a little girl in his classroom, the parents are very concerned that he is going to potentially sexually assault somebody. And so we are stressing with him these open door, closed door discriminations, these who you can touch, when, where, why, and how, who can touch you, when, where, why, and how. Um, where can you engage in some of these behaviors, right? This becomes crucial because our kids are missing the social skills to pick up on that naturally. Typically, developing kids pick up naturally on the idea that you don't masturbate in the living room. You don't masturbate at grandma's house at dinner. Our kids are not going to pick up on that quite as easily because they're missing those social skills. Okay. So that becomes a crucial, crucial teaching point. But we have to recognize as parents, as uncomfortable as it might be for us, masturbation is a normal and healthy sexual behavior. And our kids should enjoy that. Now, it becomes a problem if it's engaged, if they're doing this in an inappropriate place. We need to teach them, hey, this is a bedroom activity or a shower activity. This is not a living room activity, or as I said before, this is definitely not a Walmart activity. So we might need to teach and reteach and continuously reteach those closed door discriminations. We need to make sure that our kids have enough what I call private time, meaning that they're scheduled to have downtime where they can go to their room and masturbate. If they never have downtime to be able to do that, we are much more likely to see it occur in a public environment. Um, One of the consult questions I got recently was somebody who's masturbating all day. And so I like to rule out, is this a medical issue or is this a lack of programming, lack of anything better to do issue? And when I went through the scenario with the clinician, this person does not have a day program, does not have any regularly scheduled activities throughout their day, and pretty much the choices are masturbate or watch TV. So if we are concerned about frequency of masturbation, we need to make sure that the person has other things that are worthwhile doing. Um, we also need to, and again, this as parents, this can be uncomfortable. We need to make sure that the person has the ability to masturbate without causing pain. So this might mean that you're in the uncomfortable position of buying a lubricant. You might even be in the uncomfortable position of having the conversation with them about using the lubricant. Um, when we get to, excessive masturbation, the person's masturbating all the time, other sexual behaviors, touching inappropriately, etc., it becomes important to consult with a behavior analyst who has experience and knowledge related to sexual behavior, whether it's myself or one of my colleagues, because there are a lot of kind of like there are a lot of details that can go into this. It can be a medical issue, it can be a medication issue, it can be a skill deficit where the person doesn't have the skills to know that this is a private closed door behavior. It can be an issue where the person doesn't have the skills to masturbate effectively. So there are many scenarios that can play out as that in terms of producing or maintaining a sexual behavior that is for some reason inappropriate. And so again, it becomes very important to consult with somebody who is a behavior analyst who has specific training in sexuality. I've talked a little bit already about vulnerability, and I've given a couple examples of people with developmental disabilities who've been perpetrated against. The statistics are alarming on the likelihood of the frequency of people with developmental disabilities being sexually perpetrated against. It is I mean, I don't want to say accepted, but the statistics indicate that up to 100% of people with developmental disabilities experience some form of abuse or exploitation in their life. That could be financial, physical, emotional, sexual, and the sexual abuse statistics are pretty high. So again, teaching our kids, teaching our students, teaching our learners um, about self-protection, about reporting, that becomes the biggest uh, strategy. We cannot shelter the person forever. That's not going to happen. The idea of stranger danger, I have this on this slide for a reason here. The idea of stranger danger is inappropriate here because the majority of people with developmental disabilities who are perpetrated against by somebody they know. It's a caregiver, it's a family member, it's a sibling, it's a parent, it's a person, somebody in their day program, it's somebody in their residential facility. And so what we don't want to teach is like be concerned about the policeman, the fireman, or the mailman. What we want to teach is be concerned about strange behavior. We want to talk about people should not be touching your genitals unless it's mom or dad or the doctor when mom or dad is present. Anything beyond that is not okay. The doctor cannot check you in the bathroom. The doctor cannot check you at the mall. That is strange behavior, right? But we don't want kids to be concerned about strangers because there have been scenarios where kids have been unwilling to listen to or go with, for example, a police officer or a firefighter, because they were a stranger, but this person was trying to save their life, right? So we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently teach that type of stranger danger. Menstruation, we should be teaching menstrual hygiene long before it's needed. Um, I'm going to show you a couple of slides here in a minute about some different teaching tools. There's a great author, Terry Kuenhoven is her name. She has a great book called The Girl's Guide to Growing Up. I don't have it with me, but I have it on a slide. And she's got a task analysis with pictures on how to teach menstrual hygiene. And it's fantastic. I have a few others. If people want or need them, I'm happy to email them to people. Um, But we want to start teaching menstrual hygiene early before it becomes necessary. Use food coloring or ketchup or whatever you need to use to demonstrate what it's going to look like so that she doesn't freak out and how to change a pad. Start teaching this early because it's not going to be a one and done the way it would be with a learner who has, no cognitive impairment. We always want to make sure that the language that we use is obviously the education rather it uses language that our kids can understand and then use any visual aids as needed. So like, for example, this book, The Boy's Guide to Growing Up, has pictures in it so that you can explain to a boy, for example, the changes in his body so that what it looks like when he's a child versus what it's going to look like when he's a man, when he's done growing. And so there are a lot of books out there that have pictures available like this for both biological males and biological females, and those can be very helpful in helping a learner with a cognitive impairment understand the changes that their body is going to go through. Hygiene as well. There's another book I have here called Personal Hygiene, What's Got to Do with Me. And it's actually very funny. So this learner that I've been talking about a couple times, he goes, they're dirty, need to vacuum them. So he has the idea that the vacuum is a way to get clean or clean something, but he's not realizing that we don't vacuum people and that in fact these people need to take a shower, right? So that becomes some of the teaching. We want to teach hygiene in terms of daily living skills, looking clean, smelling clean. You can find pretty much everything on YouTube if you need a video model. When it comes to deodorants, I've been recommending roll-on deodorants, the liquid with the roller ball, as opposed to a stick or a spray. They tend to be the easiest to apply. So if you have a learner who either has got issues with applying thing or doing things with adequate pressure or intensity, The roller ball can kind of be a better way to ensure that they have adequate application. It's also easier to apply. Um, a lot of our learners, especially those with autism spectrum disorder, are very sensitive to smells. So we might want to take them to the store to pick a smell that they like or just go with something unscented. All right, let's look at the menstrual hygiene stuff. So here's one example of a picture schedule for changing a pad. Walk in the bathroom, pull down underwear, remove the soiled pad, wrap it up, wipe with toilet paper, open a clean pad, throw away the wrapper, put the pad in underwear, pull up pants, and flush the toilet. This might be adequate for somebody's daughter. This might not be adequate for somebody's daughter. We might need to break down the section of putting the pad in the underwear. We might need to teach them more specifically how to open it up, take off the paper tabs, put them in the, right? So this is just an example. Obviously, things need to be customized for the learner. Here's a more extensive example. Um, um, so this is a whole social story about how to change my pad. And it gives much more details about getting a new pad, opening it, remove the paper, put the clean pad in my underwear, making sure it sticks, right? So different learners are going to need different amounts of instruction when it comes to these things. And so we have to, again, it helps to work with somebody who has access to these kinds of things, but also has the knowledge on how to program for your particular learner. Here's another one about when to change my menstrual pad. So this one is I'll change my hygiene product at lunch and before dinner and when I get ready for bed. Oh, sorry, when I get up in the morning. Sometimes blood might get on my underwear by accident, and I'll let my mom know if I need help washing things. These all come from the a group called the Advocate Medical Group, the Adult Down Syndrome Center. So Terry Kuenhoven, who's the author of this book, was working for many, many years with an organization specific for people with Down syndrome. And she's the one who generously gave me these to use. Yet another one. So I'm just going to flip through. All right, education. I've mentioned, I've shown you the Boys Guide to Growing Up. There's a complimentary Girls Guide to Growing Up. This book, Teaching Children with Down Syndrome About Their Bodies, Boundaries, and Sexuality. All three of these are written by Terry Kuenhoven. I adore her. She's a special educator who is a certified sex educator as well. And she, like I said, was working with an organization that worked with people with Down syndrome. All of these books are good for anybody with a developmental disability, and she is just a solid, solid educator. Dave Hingsberger was a phenomenal educator as well. He was a social worker in Canada, and he also put out some phenomenal books and training programs. Here are just some more examples of things that we can use to teach our children. This is stuff for biological girls. Just again, some examples of things that we can use to teach, for example, what breast changes will look like or what pubic area changes will look like. Here are some examples for the biological males. I use this one on the left from the Mayo Clinic as a bad example. Realistically, what most of our learners need to know is the difference between an erection and a non-erection. They don't need to be able to label everything on the male genitalia, right? So I use this as a bad example. The better example is the ones over here on the right, where we demonstrate what sexual arousal looks like. Um, I talked already about some of the public stuff. Masturbation with inappropriate items can be a problem for some of our learners. Behavior directed at others can be a problem for some of our learners. And so, again, education becomes key. Working with a behavior analyst who understands behavior, but specifically working with a behavior analyst who understands sexual behavior can become very essential if you have a child, a learner, a student who is engaging in some form of inappropriate sexual behavior. Because again, a lot of these things can have medical underlying causes. There can be skill deficits that we need to address, etc. So here's an example of a very rudimentary task analysis for teaching male masturbation. And it starts off with, I go to my bedroom, I go to a private place, I shut the door. And it ends with cleaning up. So I like that example. Here's a written task analysis. If you have somebody who can follow a written task analysis versus a picture. And again, I go to my bedroom and I close the door. I go wash my hands in the bathroom. So we're embedding the closed door and the hygiene into the process. I'm not going to go through this now, but this was an example of how to teach those open door, closed door discriminations. I can make this available if somebody needs, but I recognize that we're short on time here. Um, these were just some of the stimuli that we used, some of the pictures that we used to teach the open door and closed door discrimination. And really the student was just putting the closed door on top of closed door activities and behaviors and the open door on top of open door activities and behaviors and learning in this way. We used a variety of closed door images and open door images so that they would generalize and learn to associate to multiple doors and not just the two doors that were in the pictures. We talked about inappropriate behavior. Okay, and then I've got resources here. Um, I'm happy to stick around and answer some questions if the remaining people have any. Um, and yeah, I can make my email address available if people want specific resources. Go ahead, Renee.